My husband teaches 11th grade history at a public school in Nashville, Tennessee. He earns $43,000 a year before taxes. He comes home every evening with ink on his fingers and paper stuffed into a bag he bought secondhand 7 years ago. And no matter how tired he is, no matter what kind of day he had, he reads our daughter one chapter of whatever book she chooses before she closes her eyes. My father earns more in a single afternoon than my husband earns in a full month. He drives a car that costs more than our house. He has his name on 3 buildings downtown. And at his 40th anniversary dinner, in a room full of 60 people who all considered themselves important, he pointed at my husband across the table and said 6 words that still echo in my chest. A teacher. You chose a teacher. He said it the way you say something shameful out loud. He said it slowly. He let it hang in the air so that every single person in that room could hear it, absorb it, and silently agree with it. My 7-year-old daughter was sitting right beside me. 60 people heard those 6 words. My husband did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He set down his fork, looked at my father, and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a weak smile. The kind of smile that belongs exclusively to a man carrying a secret too extraordinary to share just yet. 3 weeks later, my father would stand in a crowd of 400 people and learn exactly what kind of man he had spent years trying to erase. My name is Maya. I am 32 years old, and this is the story of how an entire town answered for my husband. The first time my father met Daniel Mercer, he shook his hand for exactly 2 seconds. I counted. I had been counting the things my father did my entire life because it was the only way I could make sense of the gaps between what he said and what he meant. 2 seconds. And then he turned back to his business partner and resumed a conversation about property tax rates in Williamson County, as if Daniel had never walked through the door at all. I had brought Daniel home to meet my parents for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in late October. We had been dating for 8 months. I was 24 years old. I had told my mother on the phone the night before, and her response had been careful and quiet in the particular way that meant she was already worried. But I had not told my father what Daniel did for a living. I wanted him to see the man first. That plan did not survive the first 5 minutes. My father asked the question the way he asked every question, like an interrogation wearing the costume of small talk. So what is it you do? Daniel smiled and said he taught history at a public high school in East Nashville. My father's face did not change. That was the particular skill of Robert Calloway. He never showed shock or surprise. He simply filed information away and quietly decided what it was worth. In that moment, I watched him decide that Daniel Mercer was worth very little. The afternoon continued. My mother made pot roast. My father talked about his newest acquisition, a commercial property development near the stadium, and he spoke to Daniel exactly twice more during that entire visit. Once to ask if he wanted more water. Once to tell him where the bathroom was. Daniel was gracious and warm throughout. He asked my father thoughtful and genuinely curious questions about his work. My father answered every one of them in single sentences. On the drive home, I waited for Daniel to say something. He turned on the radio, hummed along to a song I did not recognize, and when we stopped at a red light, he looked at me and said, "He will come around." I nodded. I did not believe it. I had known my father for 24 years. I grew up in a household where success was measured in square footage and net worth. My father had built everything he owned starting from his mid-20s, and he was proud of it in the particular way that sometimes tips over into contempt for people who have built less. He was not a cruel man in the way that word gets used in dramatic stories. He was something more specific and more difficult. He was a man who believed, completely and without question, that any life smaller than his own was a life that had settled for less than it deserved. And in his precise worldview, a teacher's life was the smallest life a capable and intelligent man could possibly choose. What my father did not know, and never once bothered to find out, was the kind of teacher Daniel actually was. Daniel had grown up in a small town in rural Tennessee, the son of a mechanic and a woman who cleaned hotel rooms. He was the first person in his family to complete college. He did not become a teacher because he could not think of anything better to do with his degree. He became a teacher because a man named Mr. Benson had spent 2 years of Daniel's childhood convincing a skinny, distracted, overlooked kid from a struggling household that his mind was genuinely worth something. Daniel never forgot what that felt like. He walked back into a classroom at 22 years old specifically to give that feeling to someone else. By the time I brought him home to meet my father, Daniel had already been nominated for a district teaching award. He already knew the names of every student's siblings, every parent's occupation, every small detail that made a teenager feel seen rather than processed. He coached the debate team on his own time with no extra pay. He bought classroom supplies out of his own paycheck every semester when the school budget ran out. He stayed late. He graded with honesty. He showed up every single morning. My father saw none of that. He saw a salary and a title and made his entire decision in 2 seconds. What I did not know then, sitting in that car at the red light while Daniel hummed softly and smiled at the road, was that the decision my father made that October afternoon would one day cost him something no amount of real estate money could ever buy back: his reputation. I had not spoken to my mother in 14 months when her name appeared on my phone screen on a Wednesday evening in September. I was sitting in the hospital parking lot, still wearing scrubs, eating a granola bar I had not had time to eat during my 12-hour shift. The screen lit up. Sandra Calloway. Not Mom. I had not changed the contact name back in a very long time. I almost let it go to voicemail. I sat there through 3 full rings, watching the name glow in the dark of the car, and then I answered. I answered because I had a 7-year-old daughter at home, and she had grandparents somewhere on the other side of a silence that no one had officially ended, and the weight of that gap had been pressing on me for months in ways I had not yet said out loud. Maya. Her voice was soft and immediately familiar in a way that made something tighten in my chest. I am so glad you picked up. I said hello. I waited. She told me about the anniversary party. 40 years? The last Saturday in October, at the house. The same house where I had grown up. She said there would be 60 people, family, close friends, neighbors from the street, people my parents had known for decades. She said it was going to be a real celebration and that it would not feel complete without me there. And then she said, the thing I had known was coming from the moment she first started speaking. Your father has changed, Maya. I genuinely believe that. I looked out through the windshield at the amber glow of the parking lot lights. I had heard those words before, in different combinations, arranged in different orders, over the course of many years. He has changed. He is trying. He asks about you. They were always the same fundamental words shuffled into a new sequence, and every single time I had chosen to believe them, it had cost me something I could not entirely recover. But she kept talking. She told me my father had been quieter lately, more reflective, that he asked about Lily more than he used to, unprompted and without any of the usual edge, that 2 weeks earlier he had sat all the way through a documentary about teachers in America and had not said a single dismissive word the entire time. And then she said the detail that made me close my eyes. She told me that he kept a photograph in the top drawer of his desk. A photo that someone had sent him of Lily at her birthday party. A birthday party he had not been invited to attend. I did not say anything for a long time after she told me that. Here is what is important to understand about my father, the thing no one who did not grow up in that house could fully appreciate. Robert Calloway was not a monster. He was not cruel in the theatrical way that word gets used. He was something harder to explain and in some ways, harder to forgive. He was a man whose ideas about the world had calcified over 62 years into something completely immovable. He had watched his own father struggle with nothing, and he had decided early and permanently that the only real protection against that kind of struggle was money and visible status. He had built both with tremendous effort. He had organized his entire identity around both. And anyone who did not share or pursue those same values was, in his honest and unwavering opinion, making a dangerous and foolish mistake with the one life they had been given. He was not trying to wound Daniel. He genuinely believed, in the way that only truly certain people believe anything, that he was protecting me from a choice I would eventually regret. That did not make any of it hurt less, but it made it possible, barely, to consider walking back through that door. Daniel was in the kitchen when I arrived home. He was making pasta. Lily was at the table drawing something elaborate with 3 different colored pencils. The house smelled like garlic and warmth, and the particular ordinary goodness of an evening with nothing wrong in it. I sat down and watched them for a moment before I said a word. Daniel looked up, read something in my face, and turned off the burner. He sat across from me and waited. I told him about the call. I told him every detail. I told him every word my mother had said, and then I sat back and waited for his response. He looked at Lily for a long, quiet moment. Then he looked back at me. "I think we should go," he said. I stared at him. "You do not have to say that." He shook his head slowly. "I am not saying it to be generous. I am saying it because Lily deserves the chance to know her grandparents if there is any possibility it could be good for her. And I am saying it because I am not afraid of your father, Maya. I never have been." I looked at him across that table in that warm kitchen and felt something I did not have a clean name for. Pride, perhaps, or something sharper and quieter than pride. "Okay," I said. "We will go." I had absolutely no idea what I was walking us into. We drove to my parents' house on a Saturday evening in late October, when the air finally carried the first real bite of autumn. Lily sat in the back seat with her chin resting on the window ledge, watching the neighborhood change as we got closer, the yards growing larger, the houses pulling further back from the road. I had bought her a new dress for the occasion, deep green with a white collar. She looked like something out of a storybook. I had not been inside that house in over 3 years. When we pulled into the driveway, I could already see people through the warm, golden light of the living room windows. Someone had hired a caterer. Cars were parked all the way down the block in both directions. My mother had always known how to build a beautiful event around a silence she was trying to fill. We were barely through the front door when I heard my father's voice from across the room. He was standing near the fireplace talking to a man I recognized as one of his contractors, and when he saw us, he did something I had not prepared myself for. He smiled. Not the polished social smile he wore at business events and community dinners. Something smaller and less certain than that. The smile of a man who had rehearsed this specific moment and was now standing inside it and doubting whether the rehearsal had been anywhere near enough. He crossed the room and hugged me first. It was stiff and brief, but it was sincere. Then he looked down at Lily and his expression changed completely. He crouched down to her level and said, "You must be Lily." She stared at him with the fearless and completely unfiltered directness of a 7-year-old and said, "You have a very big house." He laughed out loud. It was the most genuine sound I had heard come out of him in years, possibly longer. Then he straightened up and looked at Daniel. "Daniel." One single word. A nod. No handshake extended. Daniel nodded back steadily. "Good evening, sir. Congratulations on 40 years. His voice was warm and completely unhurried. My father held his gaze for exactly 1 beat and then turned back toward the fireplace. That was the first signal. The evening moved forward around us. My mother appeared and held both of my hands and kissed my cheek, and looked at Lily as though she was seeing something she had been afraid might never arrive. Aunts and cousins I had not seen in years emerged from every corner of the house. Lily was pulled into conversations about school and which animals she liked best and what she wanted to be when she grew up. The house filled with noise and wine and the specific energy of a large family gathering where everyone is performing a version of happiness for the people standing nearest to them. But underneath all of it, running quietly along the floor like something electrical, I could feel the current. My father's brother, Uncle Ray, cornered Daniel near the back porch within the first 30 minutes and spent a long time asking him about teaching in a tone that wrapped each question inside a small, comfortable verdict. Must be tough now that summers off are not the free ride people imagine, right? And then, what does retirement even look like for someone in your position? Daniel answered every question with patience and genuine specificity. Uncle Ray nodded deliberately after each answer, the way a person nods when they have already made a decision and are simply waiting for a pause to move on. My cousin Brent, who worked for my father's company and had long ago decided that the safest professional strategy was to perform my father's opinions loudly in public, materialized at the appetizer table beside Daniel. He looked at Daniel's shoes with a grin and said, "Still in the classroom, huh? Brave man. I would need a lot more than summers off to spend all year surrounded by teenagers." He laughed at his own joke. Daniel smiled pleasantly and said, "The students are genuinely the best part of it." Brent looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has fundamentally missed a point they consider obvious. I was standing close enough to hear every word of every one of those exchanges. I watched my husband move through each of them with a quiet and unshakable dignity that made the back of my throat ache. Because I already knew with absolute certainty that none of it was going to stop at appetizers. When the announcement came that dinner was ready and the room began its slow migration toward the dining room, I caught my father looking at Daniel with an expression I recognized from a lifetime of watching that face. He was not done. The dining room table seated 20. The remaining 40 guests were arranged across the living room and the back porch at fold-out tables my mother had dressed with the same careful attention she brought to everything she ever organized. My father sat at the head of the main table, my mother to his right. I was seated directly across from Daniel, with Lily in the chair beside me. For the first 20 minutes, the dinner was manageable. There was wine, good food, and the kind of surface conversation that floats just high enough above anything real to keep everyone comfortable. Someone told a story about a family vacation from 15 years ago that got the whole table laughing. My mother asked Lily if she liked school, and Lily said yes, but that her teacher gave too much homework on Fridays specifically, which got more laughter than anything else all evening. My father presided over all of it from the head of the table with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man surveying everything he has built and finding it sufficient. And then someone nearby, and I have never decided whether it was accidental or deliberate, mentioned that a mutual friend's son had just accepted a position at a financial firm in Atlanta. The salary attached to that position was said out loud. My father nodded with visible approval. "That is what a serious education pays off," he said. "Smart young man. Smart family." Then he looked at me. Not at Daniel. At me. As if Daniel were simply not occupying the chair 3 feet to his left. "Maya, I always said you were among the most capable students at your school. Your mother used to bring me your nursing school grades without even being asked. Top of your class. You could have gone in any direction." He paused, and the pause was perfectly timed and entirely intentional. It is interesting to see where people ultimately end up. The table went quiet in the particular way that large dinner tables go quiet when everyone present understands that something has just begun, but no one yet knows how large it is going to become. Daniel set his fork down, very slowly, without making a sound. My father continued. His voice remained calm and conversational, which made every word land harder. "I find myself thinking about potential lately. About the choices people make with what they were given by God and circumstance. A man with Daniel's intelligence, for example." He gestured toward my husband with one open hand, the way you gesture toward a piece of furniture you are describing to someone who cannot see it. Clearly capable, but the choice to spend the best years of a man's life inside a classroom. For what purpose exactly? A modest state pension, summers off, a title that carries no weight outside the building. Lily looked up from her plate. Not one person at that table said a word. My father looked directly at Daniel for the first time since we had sat down. I am not suggesting the work is without value. I am simply saying that the choice itself reveals something about a man's ambition, about what he is ultimately willing to accept for himself. I felt heat move from the center of my chest straight up into my throat. I put down my own fork. I opened my mouth. Daniel's hand found mine under the table. One single, brief touch. Not the touch of a man trying to silence me. The touch of a man telling me, quietly and completely, that he had this. He looked at my father. His voice came out steady and unhurried, the same voice I had heard him use in a classroom when he wanted a room full of restless 16-year-olds to actually stop and listen. Mr. Calloway, what you have built over your life is genuinely impressive. I want you to know I mean that. I also want you to know that I am exactly where I chose to be, doing exactly what I believe matters most. I do not measure that in salary. I measure it in what I leave behind in people. He picked up his fork and continued eating. My father looked at him for a long-held moment. Then he made a small sound, somewhere between a dismissive exhale and a polite acknowledgement. He turned back to the table and said, "Well, that is certainly a generous way to think about it." The table exhaled. The conversation stitched itself back together. Within 3 minutes, people were discussing something else entirely. But I watched the other faces. My Aunt Patricia, who had never once in living memory openly contradicted her brother about anything, was staring down at her plate with the very careful expression of a person holding something tightly inside. My cousin Rachel, who had never been particularly warm toward Daniel, was looking at him now with something entirely different in her eyes. Even the contractor seated farther down the table, a man who barely knew any of us, had gone completely still. My husband had said 31 words to my father, and every single person at that table had felt the weight of each one. We left the party at 9:15. Lily was asleep against my shoulder before we reached the end of my parents' street. Daniel drove with one hand resting on the wheel, the radio off, and neither of us said anything for almost 5 full minutes. I was the one who broke it. "I am sorry." I said it before I had organized how to say it properly. "I am so sorry for what he said." Daniel glanced over at me. "You do not need to apologize for your father. He humiliated you in front of 60 people at his own dinner table." My voice came out thicker and less controlled than I intended. "He tried to." He paused. "There is a meaningful difference between those two things." I looked at him in the dark interior of the car, his face moving in and out of the light from passing street lamps, and I did not know whether what I felt was admiration or the particular frustration that only comes from loving someone who is entirely too composed. He was too calm. He had been too calm for the entire evening. This was not the calm of a person suppressing something painful. This was the calm of a man who was not worried because he had a specific reason not to be worried. "Daniel." I kept my voice low on account of Lily. "What is going on?" He smiled at the windshield ahead of him. "Nothing I am ready to discuss just yet." That is not a satisfying answer. He laughed quietly. "I am aware. Give me a couple of weeks." The following morning, I was in a state of controlled and very precise fury. I called my cousin Rachel, who had been seated at the table, and she told me that after we left, my Aunt Patricia had said to my mother, loudly enough for the people remaining at the table to hear clearly, "Sandra, your husband embarrassed this family tonight." My mother had not responded to that. My father had refilled his wineglass. 3 of the guests had packed up and left within the following hour. The story was already circulating the way stories always circulate within close families, quietly but with remarkable completeness and speed. But Daniel went to school on Monday morning exactly the way he went to school every Monday morning. He made coffee in the early dark before anyone else was awake, packed his bag, kissed Lily on her forehead as she slept, kissed me, and was out the door before 7 o'clock. No brooding, no long and loaded conversation about confrontation or about what our next steps should be. Just Daniel, going to work. It was genuinely maddening. On Thursday evening of that same week, something unusual happened. Daniel's phone buzzed 3 separate times during dinner, which almost never occurred because he kept it face down on the table while we ate and treated that as a firm household rule. He glanced at it once, smiled privately at something on the screen, and turned it face down again. "Good news?" I asked. "Developing news," he said. I put my fork down on the table. "Daniel Marcus Mercer." He looked up from his plate. He knew from the full name that I was not asking a casual question. He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they have made an internal decision. "All right," he said. "I will tell you part of it." He told me about Marcus Webb. Marcus was 17 years old, and in the third seat from the window in Daniel's third period class. He had arrived at Franklin High 2 years earlier, from a group home on the east side of the city after his mother had entered long-term residential treatment, and his father had been entirely absent for years before that. He was quiet and visibly intelligent, and had spent the majority of his life being overlooked by every adult who should have noticed him first. Daniel had noticed him on the second day of the school year. Over the next 2 years, Daniel had worked with Marcus through lunch periods, before school in the mornings, and on the phone on weekend afternoons. He had personally contacted a college counselor at Vanderbilt University who agreed as a professional courtesy to guide Marcus through his applications at no charge. He had driven Marcus to campus visits on 3 separate Saturdays. He had written recommendation letters for 11 different schools. 2 days before my father's anniversary dinner, Marcus had received a letter from Harvard University, a full scholarship. I sat very still on the other side of the table. "He got in," I said. Daniel nodded once. "He got in." I looked at my husband. This man with ink on his fingers and a second-hand bag and a salary my father had called a symptom of settling, and I felt something shift inside my chest that I did not have the precise word for. "What else?" I asked, because I knew with complete certainty that there was more. He smiled. "That is enough for tonight." The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was helping Lily find her left shoe before school. Daniel had already left for work. My phone rang, and the name on the screen was one I did not recognize. Dr. Elaine Holt. Something about the area code made me answer. "Is this Maya Mercer?" The woman's voice was warm and professional at the same time. "Daniel's wife?" "Yes," I said. "My name is Dr. Elaine Holt. I am a senior acquisitions editor at Beacon Press in New York. I have been in contact with your husband for some months now, and I am calling because we have formally extended an offer this morning. I fully expect Daniel will tell you himself tonight, but I wanted to call personally because I felt strongly that the people who love him should understand how genuinely remarkable this is." I sat down on the edge of the bed. Lily appeared in the doorway holding her shoe. I held up one finger. She sat down on the floor and put it on herself. "I am sorry," I said carefully. "What offer?" A small pause. "His book," she said. "The weight of the lesson. He has not told you?" He had not told me. For 3 full years, while I thought he was reading on weekend mornings before the house woke up, while I thought he was catching up on grading during school-free periods, while I thought he was simply existing in the quiet hours before the day began, my husband had been writing a book. He had submitted the completed manuscript to Beacon Press 8 months ago. They had come back with a revision request. He had made every revision, and 2 weeks before my father's anniversary dinner, they had called him to confirm they were ready to move forward. The manuscript was 340 pages. It was about the interior life of teaching, the parts no one on the outside ever sees. About what it actually means to stand in front of a room full of young people and believe, without any external validation, that their futures matter more than your own convenience. About the students who never make headlines but whose lives are permanently and unmistakably shaped by a single teacher who made the decision to stay invested. It was honest and precise and deeply personal, and Dr. Holt told me, with the measured language of someone who had been in publishing for 27 years, that it was one of the most powerful manuscripts her imprint had considered in a full decade. I sat on the bed for a very long time after I set the phone down. When Daniel came home that evening, I was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone completely cold beside me. He walked through the door, looked at my face, and stopped moving. "Elaine called," I said. He set his bag on the floor. "I was going to tell you tonight." 3 years, Daniel." He sat down across from me. I did not want to say anything until there was something real to say. I did not want you to invest hope in something and then have to be there when it did not happen. I looked at him steadily. "You were protecting me from disappointment." "Something close to that." "While my father was sitting at a table calling you a man who settled." He was quiet. I reached across the table and took both of his hands in mine. I did not have words that were large enough for the moment, so I did not try to manufacture them. But the book was not the whole of it. The following Saturday afternoon, Daniel came home from a brief meeting at the school and sat across from me with an expression I had never once seen on his face before. Not quite pride. Something quieter. Something that looked almost like stunned gratitude. He told me what Marcus had done. In the weeks after receiving his Harvard acceptance, without telling Daniel, Marcus had tracked down and contacted 43 of Daniel's former students through social media and direct email. He had asked each of them a single direct question. "What did Mr. Mercer do for you that no one else ever did?" Within 72 hours, he had written responses from 39 of them. He had compiled every response, attached a formal personal letter and all supporting documentation, and submitted the entire package to the Tennessee State Board of Education as a formal Teacher of the Year nomination. The board had reviewed the submission and contacted the school. Daniel had been named a finalist, but Marcus had done one thing more. He had also published all 43 student stories on a simple, clean webpage. A parent at the school had found it first, then another. Then a local journalist had discovered it. The page had received 4,000 individual visits within 48 hours. My father's dinner table felt as though it belonged to a completely different world. I found out the true scale of what was happening not from Daniel, not from the school, but from a colleague at the hospital. It was a Thursday morning, and I was charting at the nurse's station when a woman I had worked alongside for 2 years leaned across the counter and said, "Hey, is your husband a teacher at Franklin High?" I said yes. She turned her tablet around and held it in front of me. The webpage Marcus had built had been visited 40,000 times. Someone had taken a screenshot of one of the student stories and shared it to a community Facebook group, and it had been reshared over 600 times in less than 48 hours. A local television news station had reached out to the school for an interview. A journalist named Carla Simmons from the Nashville Banner had published a piece that morning under the headline, "The Teacher 39 Students Say Changed Their Lives," and that piece had already been picked up and republished by 3 separate regional outlets. I stood at the nurse's station and read every word of every story on the screen. They were specific in the way that only true stories are specific. A former student named Jade had written that after her mother was hospitalized during Jade's junior year, she had been silently failing 3 subjects. She wrote that Daniel was the only teacher who called her at home every single week that following summer and read history chapters over the phone with her so she would not fall behind and lose the year. A young man named Tyler, who had been suspended twice before the end of his freshman year, wrote that Daniel was the first adult in the school building who had ever asked him what was happening at home instead of what rule he had broken. A woman who was now a practicing public defender wrote that Daniel had spent 4 months of her senior year working with her on preparation for a debate competition she had not been selected for, but wanted to enter independently anyway. She wrote that learning to stand in front of strangers and speak with confidence became the single skill her entire career was built upon. I read every last word. Then I walked into the supply closet, closed the door, and cried quietly for 4 minutes. Then I washed my face at the small sink, looked at myself in the mirror for a moment, and walked back to the nurse's station. That evening, Principal Hargrove called Daniel at home. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to Daniel's side of the conversation, which consisted largely of, "Yes, sir," and "I understand completely," and one extended silence during which Daniel lowered himself slowly into a chair and tilted his head back to look at the ceiling. After he set the phone down, he told me that the selection process had concluded. He had been named Tennessee State Teacher of the Year. A formal recognition ceremony would be held at Franklin High in 11 days. The superintendent of schools would be in attendance. The mayor's office had reached out to the school directly. And because of the volume of press coverage, the wave of community response, and the momentum that had gathered entirely organically over the preceding 2 weeks, the school was anticipating the auditorium to be at full capacity. Full capacity, I repeated. "They are setting up overflow seating inside the gymnasium," he said quietly. I stared at him from across the table. "Daniel." "I know. 400 people." He was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice shifted in a way that changed the entire temperature of the room. "Marcus organized this," he said. "A 17-year-old kid who came through the foster system decided that I deserved to be seen, and he constructed something from nothing to ensure that it happened." He paused. "What is happening is not about me. It is about who Marcus has become." I had no argument for that. He was absolutely right. But Marcus could not have become the person who built that webpage and made those calls and wrote those letters without the man sitting in front of me. There was one question I had been carrying for a week without asking it. "Are you going to invite my parents?" Daniel looked at me for a long, still moment. "Your mother has already been invited," he said. "The ceremony was announced through the school as an open community event." "And my father?" Daniel reached for his coffee. "Your mother called me yesterday while you were at work." I blinked. "She called you directly?" "She asked whether it would be appropriate for her to bring Robert." He looked at me with complete steadiness. "I told her the ceremony was open to the entire community and that she was welcome to bring anyone she chose." The corner of his mouth moved. Barely. But it moved. "Then she told me she had already submitted an RSVP for 2. I did not learn how my mother had persuaded my father to attend until my Aunt Patricia called me on a Sunday afternoon, 6 days before the ceremony. Patricia was my father's older sister, and she had spent her entire adult life choosing peace over confrontation inside the family. But when she called that Sunday, her voice was barely containing something that sounded very much like satisfaction. "Your mother told him it was a community education event at a local school," she said. "She told him the district superintendent was going to be present and that it was precisely the kind of civic event that people in their neighborhood attended. She did not tell him a single word about what the event was actually for." I went very still. "He agreed to go based on that?" "He agreed because Sandra mentioned that the Hendersons from the club were attending, and that Gerald Whitmore from the Chamber of Commerce had confirmed. You know your father. Being seen at the right events matters enormously to him." I held that information in silence for a long time after I hung up. My mother, soft-spoken, conflict-avoidant, 40 years of smoothing over, Everything Sandra Calloway had executed something I had never once seen her attempt. She had not confronted Robert. She had not issued an ultimatum or a speech or a dramatic declaration of any kind. She had simply, quietly, deliberately arranged for him to be standing in the correct room at the correct moment. No argument, no confrontation, just placement. She had, without knowing it, done exactly what Daniel would have done. The week leading up to the ceremony was strange in the specific way that precedes something irreversible. My phone rang more than it had in years. My cousin Rachel called to say she had read the newspaper article and wanted to know if she could come. Aunt Patricia called to announce she was bringing her entire book club. 3 of my nursing colleagues asked if they could attend because their own children had been students of Daniel's at various points. The school sent a second email to the community because the first request for overflow seating had already filled beyond expected capacity. Daniel himself was exactly the same as he always was. The evening before the ceremony, he graded a set of papers at the kitchen table, packed his school bag, pressed the dark blue shirt he planned to wear, and hung it carefully on the back of the closet door, and then went to bed at a completely ordinary hour and fell asleep the way he always fell asleep, completely and immediately. I lay beside him and did not sleep at all. I thought about my father at 35, exactly the age Daniel was now, driving a used pickup between job sites in the early morning dark, betting every dollar and every ounce of energy he had on an idea that had not yet become a single building. I thought about how much of himself my father had poured into that particular story. The self-built man, the man who chose correctly, the man who bet on the things that mattered. I thought about how genuinely terrifying it must be to construct your entire identity on what you own, and then to sit across a dinner table from a man who has built his entirely on what he gives. The morning of the ceremony, I woke at 5 and made breakfast, and Lily came downstairs still in her pajamas and climbed directly into Daniel's lap while he drank his coffee. I stood at the counter watching them and did not say anything. "Are you nervous?" Lily asked him with complete seriousness. "A little bit," he said. She considered this. "Do not be nervous," she told him firmly. "You are the best teacher in the entire world, even better than Miss Garrett. And Miss Garrett lets the class have snack time whenever she decides they have earned it." He laughed and pulled her close and looked at me over the top of her head. I turned back to the counter because I was not going to cry in the kitchen before 7 in the morning. We arrived at Franklin High at 4 in the afternoon. The ceremony began at 5. The parking lot was already more than half full when we pulled in, and I drove slowly because I needed a moment to understand what I was actually seeing. Families with young children, people in their 20s and 30s who had driven in from other cities, parents holding signs they had made themselves, a woman standing near the main entrance holding a bouquet of flowers. The local news van was parked near the gymnasium doors with its satellite raised. I found Marcus near the side entrance of the auditorium. He was 17 years old in a pressed white shirt, and his hands were shaking slightly with the particular tremor of a young person who had set something enormous into motion and was only now, standing inside the result of it, beginning to fully understand how large it had actually grown. He saw me and straightened up immediately. "Mrs. Mercer." "Marcus." I took both of his hands in mine. "What you did?" He shook his head once. "He did it first," he said simply and without hesitation. "I just made sure the right people knew." Through the auditorium doors, every single seat was filled. I was standing near the back wall of the auditorium when my parents arrived. I saw my mother first. She was dressed with the specific care she reserved for occasions she considered important. A navy blazer, pearl earrings, her hair set the way she set it for church on significant Sundays. She was holding my father's arm as she always did in public situations, but her grip was visibly tighter than it usually was. I could see that from 20 feet away without any difficulty. My father entered the room, the way he entered every room he walked into, with the measured and entirely unconscious authority of a man accustomed to being among the most consequential people present. He scanned the rows of filled seats, the stage with its podium, and the large navy and gold banner spanning the back wall that read, "Tennessee State Teacher of the Year." And then he stopped. Not dramatically, not in any way that drew attention. A small, precise stop. The stop of a man who has just processed information that does not match the situation he was prepared for. My mother guided him gently to 2 seats in the middle section. He sat down. He read the banner again. I watched his jaw set. The ceremony began precisely at 5 o'clock. Principal Hargrove opened with a brief history of the state award and the rigor of the selection process. The district superintendent followed. She spoke for 12 minutes about what separated Daniel's record from every other finalist in the state. She referenced the 43 former students. She cited the documented outcomes, the students who had moved from academic failure to college acceptance under his consistent and personal investment. She read aloud 2 excerpts from letters that had arrived at the board office without being solicited, written by parents who had simply heard about the nomination and wanted their voices included in the record. When she finished, the auditorium was in the kind of silence that only occurs when 400 people are all feeling the same thing simultaneously. Marcus Webb took the podium. He was 17 years old. He had a small set of notes with him, but he barely glanced at them. He stood at the microphone with the posture of a young man who had made a decision that his story was worth the air it required, and who had adjusted his entire bearing to reflect that decision. He spoke for 9 minutes. He described the group home and the particular exhaustion of moving between schools and the specific loneliness of being a child with a capable mind, inside circumstances that had no interest in that capability. He described walking into Daniel's classroom on the first morning of sophomore year, expecting precisely nothing, because every prior year had taught him that nothing was the appropriate expectation. He described the first time Daniel kept him after class, not to discipline him, not to deliver a warning, to say, "I read your essay from last week. The argument you built in the 3rd paragraph is genuinely sophisticated. You should develop it further." He told the auditorium that he had stood in the hallway after that and had not known what to do with the feeling it produced in him, because no adult in an official capacity had ever said anything like that to him before. He talked about the Saturday drives to campus visits, the late-night phone calls before application deadlines, the 11 recommendation letters. The night before his Harvard interview, when Daniel had called him at 10 o'clock to say, "You already carry everything you need. Walk in and be exactly who you are." "I am going to Harvard University in the fall," Marcus said. His voice was completely steady. "I will walk through those doors carrying everything Mr. Mercer gave me. But I need every person in this room to understand something clearly. What he gave me was not charity. It was not sympathy or pity or the particular condescension of someone helping a less fortunate child. It was the radical and uncompromising belief that I was worth precisely the same investment as any student in any school, in any neighborhood, anywhere. That belief did not just help me, it fundamentally changed the direction of my life, and he gave it to me every single day on a teacher's salary. 400 people rose to their feet. I did not look at Daniel. I could not have maintained any composure if I had. I looked at my father. Robert Calloway was sitting completely still. His hands were flat on his knees. He was watching the standing ovation, 400 people on their feet for the man he had waved away, with 6 words across a dinner table 3 weeks earlier, and his face held an expression I had never in my entire life seen on it before. It was not humiliation in the way you might picture it. It was something older and heavier than that. It was the precise expression of a man who has just encountered an argument he has no preparation to counter, and no pride-preserving response to offer. The superintendent returned to the podium after the applause subsided and made one additional announcement. She said that a New York publishing house, Beacon Press, had just signed Daniel Mercer to publish his debut book, to be titled The Weight of the Lesson, and that the school library would be receiving advance reading copies within the month. The room responded again. At the reception that followed, I found my mother near the refreshment table. She was holding a small paper plate she had not eaten from. When she saw me, she set it down and wrapped both arms around me and held on in a way she had not held on since I was a child. My father was standing near the far exit, alone. Several people I recognized as Franklin High parents passed him. One stopped, looked at him without expression, and moved on. Robert Calloway was not a man who had any prior experience of being invisible inside a room, and the unfamiliarity of it was something I could see from across the space between us. Daniel found him. I watched it from a distance. Daniel crossed the room, extended his hand, and waited. My father looked at that hand for a long moment. Then he took it. Daniel spoke something I could not hear from where I stood. My father looked at the floor. Then he looked back up at Daniel and nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man receiving something he is not certain he has earned. Daniel placed one hand briefly on my father's shoulder. Then he turned back toward Marcus, who was surrounded entirely by people who had come specifically to tell him how proud of him they were. I have never asked Daniel what he said to my father in that moment. I do not need to know. Some things are complete precisely because they remain between the people who were present for them. In the weeks that followed, something shifted inside my family that I do not have a perfectly precise word for. My mother began calling every Sunday evening, not out of obligation, because she wanted to talk. Lily started video calling her grandparents twice a week, an arrangement she invented entirely on her own and then announced to both households as already decided. My father came to dinner at our house once in November. He sat across from Daniel at the same kitchen table where Daniel had told me we should go to that party, and they talked for 2 hours about Tennessee history. It turned out my father knew considerably more about it than I had ever suspected. He never apologized in words. Some people are simply not constructed for direct apologies. But he started showing up. And sometimes that is the version of an apology that a person like that is capable of giving. Daniel's book releases this spring. Marcus started at Harvard in September. He sent Daniel a photograph of his dorm room on move-in day. Daniel printed it and put it on our refrigerator. It is still there. Here is what I know. A quiet man with a second-hand bag changed lives for 15 years before anyone placed a podium in front of him. The worth was never in question. It simply took 400 people standing on their feet to help one man finally understand it. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city and the time where you are in the comments below. I am always genuinely moved by how far these stories travel. The next story is already waiting, and I promise you, it will surprise you.